In the fall of 2004, a 16-year-old girl moved to the state of Illinois in order to reconnect with her family and fulfill her dream of joining the Marines. But only a few months later, her body would be found buried in multiple areas throughout the town. This is the case of Adrian Reynolds. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also forgetting why I walked into rooms. What did I come in here for again? But anyways, today we're going over the tragic case of Adrian Reynolds, a teenage girl brutally betrayed by a group of friends that she thought she could trust. Now, just so you know, for the sake of privacy, we've changed a few names in this case, but don't worry, it won't have an impact on anything. For our story, we're heading to the great state of Illinois, particularly to a little place known as East Moline. East Moline is exactly what you think of when you think of small-town America. Much of its economy is dedicated to creating farm equipment, the people are friendly, and overall, it's generally pretty safe. But on top of this reputation, it's also intimately connected to some other regions that are collectively known as the Quad Cities. This region is home to a few different cities, including East Moline, Moline, Rock Island, and the Iowan cities of Davenport and Bettendorf. And if you're wondering why it's called the Quad Cities, despite there being 5 in total, well, that's because the Quint cities apparently just didn't have the same ring to it. But if you ever find yourself in the area, there's no shortage of things to do. You can visit the Vanderveer Botanical Park and stroll through a series of beautiful-looking trees and flowers. You could stop by the John Deere Pavilion, a giant glass building that houses some of the most mind-blowing tractors and farming equipment you'll ever see. You could hop on a boat and cruise through the Mississippi River at the small expense of a few bucks. You could even roll on over to Skate City QCA, where roller skating is the name of the game. But despite how downright intriguing all of this sounds, none of these activities are the reason as to why we're in the area today. Adrian Lee Reynolds was born on September 12th of 1988 to a teenage mother named Carolyn in El Dorado, Arkansas. Shortly after her birth, Adrian was adopted by her maternal grandparents, Beverly and Tony Reynolds. Now, Beverly, Tony, Carolyn, and the baby Adrian all lived in the same house. And because Beverly and Tony were the ones that mostly ended up raising her while she was young, Adrian did call her grandparents Mom and Dad. But before long, her grandparents ended up getting divorced, and Beverly moved to Texas, taking her daughter Carolyn and the little Adrian with her. Meanwhile, Adrian's adopted father, Tony, stayed in Arkansas. So to reiterate, because it is a bit of an uncommon living situation, Adrian was born to Carolyn, a teenager. Adopted by her grandparents, Tony and Beverly, they split up, and Beverly took Carolyn and the baby Adrian with her to Texas, while Tony stayed behind in Arkansas. Years after this split, Adrian's father, Tony, wound up in prison in Arkansas on some drug-related charges. But when he got out, he was fully rehabilitated and a changed man. And after a commitment to turning his life around, Tony then relocated to his home state of Illinois. Here in Illinois, he began dating a woman by the name of Joanne. Tony and Joanne had originally met in high school, but reconnected later, and before long, this relationship became quite serious and the couple got married. Meanwhile, throughout this time, Tony's daughter Adrian was being raised by her biological mother, Carolyn, in Kilgore, Texas, who had since gained full custody. Beverly, her grandmother, was no longer living with them, but by now, Adrian's childhood and early adolescence had already been a complete and total train wreck. Not only had she gotten used to a revolving door of people coming and going at an early age, But along the way, she got mixed into a bad crowd and found herself engaged in a lot of regrettable activity. Adrian struggled badly in school, and according to a questionnaire she took in 2003, she claimed to have tried several hard narcotics and substances starting at only 9 years old. In addition, despite now just being a little over 15, many of the questions that involved sexuality revealed her to be highly promiscuous. And one response to the question, "What do you read?" was actually quite prophetic, with her bluntly replying with the single word of murder. So maybe we just take that in for a moment. But the truth is that not all was that bad with Adrianne Reynolds. Despite having a rough life, she was outgoing, fun, and made friends quite easily. In addition, she had bold aspirations of being a country singer and a fashion designer, and talked about getting her GED so that way she could join the Marines. But pretty soon, Adrian realized that she wasn't going to be able to accomplish any of this currently where she lived in Texas. There were many reasons for this, but the worst one centered around the fact that throughout living with her mother Carolyn had a couple of different husbands, and the most recent one, a man named David, Adrian accused of. But while these charges were later dismissed, in fact, Adrian later admitted to making them up, by that point, the state had already gotten involved and placed Adrian in temporary foster care. So all in all, with this lack of stability, guidance, or opportunity, in the fall of 2003, it was officially decided that Adrian would move to Illinois and live with her father, Tony. Initially, Tony and his wife Joanne were pretty reluctant to take in Adrian simply because of her chaotic nature, but because Tony was Adrian's father, he really had no other choice. When the couple went to pick up Adrian in Arkansas, she already gave them an indication of what things would be like living with her, after she revealed something following the drive home. Apparently, after the ride, Adrian suddenly told the two of them that she was quote-unquote pregnant, which, although turned out to be false when she took a pregnancy test in Illinois the day after, was still not exactly a great start. Within a few months, it became clear that the fears that Tony and Joanne had of taking Adrian in were going to come true. They enrolled her in Glenview Middle School and frequently began having arguments with her about not doing her homework and failing out. Most of these arguments involved Adrian and her stepmother Joanne, and some became quite heated. But ultimately, Tony and Joanne ended up getting Adrian's grades up to D's, and by June of 2004, she was finally able to graduate at the age of 15. So better late than never. But also, by that point, Adrian had become restless, started missing her friends and family back home, and wanted to return to Texas. So one day, Tony called up Adrian's mother, Carolyn, in Texas, and before long, Adrian got exactly what she wanted. Quickly, after returning to Texas though, it became apparent to her that the grass is not always greener on the other side. During her brief return, she slipped right back into her old habits. And pretty soon, she was trying to run away from her mother's house to go live with a boyfriend. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Carolyn called up Tony again and asked him if he would take Adrian back, to which he reluctantly agreed. Then, after a bit of hesitancy on Adrian's part too, she got on a plane and went back to East Moline, Illinois once more. It was the fall of 2004, and within just a few short months, Adrian Reynolds was about to wind up missing. Now, every now and again, Adrian Reynolds would express herself using various artistic means, including writing poems. One of the poems she wrote in October of 2004 was pretty ominous. It went like this: knocking at death's door, entering through hell's gates. Better do something now before it's too late. What this poem likely demonstrates is the internal struggle that Adrian was dealing with during this time period. But once Adrian returned to Illinois and got settled into living with her father Tony and stepmother Joanne again, her parents really grew to love her, even with her issues. Sure, they still dealt with a lot of trouble, but in the downtime between this sort of stuff, it was hard not to love her. Adrian was very energetic and passionate and had a pretty good talent for singing. One of the things she wanted to do eventually was to go on American Idol, and she even went as far as to create an audition tape that, by all accounts, was quite impressive. But on top of this, she loved fashion design and made countless sketches and doodles combining roaring 20s clothing with modern era clothing. And she was pretty good at this sort of stuff too. The only thing though that she still struggled at was school. Something that really had nothing to do with intelligence or ability, but rather the fact that she was just very confrontational and not exactly that interested. Plus, she got teased a bit for having a noticeably southern accent, considering that she was from Texas. But during Adrian's initial stay at Tony and Joanne's house in late 2003 to mid-2004, she had gotten kicked out of 2 public schools before eventually graduating from the other middle school. And so this time, Tony and Joe figured the best solution for Adrian would be to attend a different type of school specifically for people like herself. That school was known as the Black Hawk College Outreach Center. Here, Adrian could get her GED and obtain the equivalent of a high school education. In addition, many of the kids who attended also had a history of mental health struggles and came from broken homes. So it was a lot easier to relate to these other students. But anyway, Adrian was now 16 years old, and the moment she walked into the school, she started seeking out a new group of friends. Along the way, she met a couple of kids named Sarah and Harley, and within no time, the 3 of them were hanging out pretty frequently. By the way, Harley originally went by a different name, but they have since transitioned in prison, so I'm going to use the one they've adopted. Sarah and Harley belong to a subculture known as juggalos, which consists of people who are fans of a rap group known as Insane Clown Posse. The reason why it's important to mention this is because this was a large part of their identity. But I would also like to add that most juggalos are peaceful and non-violent, so the actions of those in this story are not a reflection of the group as a whole. And while Adrian herself wasn't necessarily a juggalo, she did end up hanging around the same circles. Meanwhile, Sarah Kolb was a popular 16-year-old girl with an insatiable desire for attention and a tendency towards violent thoughts. Only a month before she met Adrian, Sarah had just recently broken up with her ex-girlfriend and was going through a bit of a depressive episode. But by the time Sarah was introduced to Adrian, she was ready to hook up with somebody new. And while initially it seemed like Adrian would fit that role quite well, before long, the 2 of them settled on being just good friends. And it's not exactly clear if they ever had relations, but they most likely didn't. Now, as for the other friend, Harley, and their relationship with Sarah, well, Harley Quinn was Sarah's best friend and a prior partner. Harley, too, was a juggalo and had an obsession with gore and violence. According to friends, Harley was soft-spoken and reserved, but every now and again would blurt out weird and violent things for no reason. And just like Adrian, Harley had also made an unspoken agreement to just be good friends with Sarah, even despite the fact that Harley was practically obsessed with her. I mean, literally to the point where Harley worshipped the ground Sarah walked on. Meanwhile, though, Sarah didn't really view Harley in the same way. She just saw Harley as a friend. But regardless, the 2 of them were inseparable, and everywhere Sarah went, Harley was right there with her. Frequently, they'd skip class and listen to music together, and Sarah was even the one who convinced Harley to relocate from their old school, which was just a normal school, to Black Hawk Outreach. So once again, you have the new girl, Adrian, the soon-to-be jealous, popular girl, Sarah Kolb, and Harley, Sarah's best friend who follows her around like a lost puppy. That was the basic dynamic. But before long, this dynamic and so-called friendship was about to blow up in the worst way imaginable. Now, similar to Adrian, Sarah Kolb was a person with extreme emotional issues. She was very possessive and territorial, and anyone who she interpreted as being in her way, she had no qualms about, quote-unquote, taking care of. But in the beginning of their friendship, Adrian didn't fit these qualifications quite yet. As we've already said, the two of them were originally quite friendly, even to the point of considering being in an intimate relationship. Frequently, Adrian and Sarah would send letters back and forth, and on top of hanging out, that's how they got to know each other. And despite deciding not to be in an actual relationship, they remained friends. And Adrian was introduced to the world of Sarah, Harley, and the Juggalos, which kind of sounds like the name of a band. But one of the major problems for Adrian from the beginning of her introduction to this group of people was a very strong desire to be part of the in-group. As the new girl, she was already an outsider. She didn't dress in dark, baggy clothes or do anything special with her hair, like spiking it up or anything, and she was hardly a fan of the insane clown posse. And so when she found herself in this new group of people, she really felt a bit out of place, even if she'd never admit it. But pretty soon, Adrian started adopting all of their habits and lifestyle, and doing everything her new friends did. One of the things the group liked to do was to hang out at this so-called party house located in a place called Rock Island. Here, they'd get drunk, use whatever substances they could get their hands on, and party. The first time Adrian visited the party house was a fateful day. She was brought there by Sarah and Harley, and evidently for Sarah, bringing Adrian here was actually part of an initiation test. By that point, Sarah and Adrian had already met and hung out a few times, but Sarah was skeptical about Adrian's character and didn't really trust her. So when she brought Adrian into the house and introduced her to all of her other friends, she wanted to see if Adrian would have with some of the boys that they were hanging out with. So not long after hanging out, Sarah told a couple of the boys, who we'll call Tyler and Josh, that Adrian wanted to, quote-unquote, get laid. And later that night, Adrian and Tyler did end up having. As for Josh, while he and Adrian did have a long, deep discussion during this night, they didn't do anything together this time. But the fact that Adrian got with Tyler ended up making Sarah absolutely furious. At this point, Sarah was sort of still considering getting into a relationship with Adrian, but now that she knew she liked boys, she wanted absolutely nothing to do with her. In addition, Sarah also realized that Adrian was suddenly receiving a lot of attention from the rest of the group, and this stirred up a tremendous amount of jealousy. Sarah essentially viewed herself as the top dog, and anything that threatened her status needed to be dealt with accordingly. So from this point forward, Sarah only spoke with Adrian sparingly, all despite Adrian desperately trying to contact her for several weeks over the phone and through handwritten notes. And to make matters even worse, the same week that Adrian visited the party house for the first time, she went over there again later in the week and ended up hooking up with the other guy, Josh. Adrian liked Josh and thought he was nice. But once news got back to Sarah, Harley, and the others that Adrian had already hooked up with two separate guys in the same week, it gave Sarah enough ammunition to try and turn the others against her. Before long, Sarah and another girl began bullying Adrian and calling her names like and. Meanwhile, Adrian couldn't really understand why Sarah hated her so much all of a sudden. She continued trying to call her and send her notes, and eventually Sarah gave in to some extent, but only for her own entertainment. Sarah would pick up the phone here and there, and then get Adrian all riled up to just laugh at her. But at a certain point, the whole thing became far more malevolent. Sometime in late December of 2004, Adrian asked Sarah how they could resolve their issues, and Sarah told her the only way that could happen was if Adrian was to slit her wrist, essentially telling her to go. And by the time the new year rolled around in January of 2005, Sarah Kolb had become increasingly irritated by Adrian's continual efforts to get answers from her. But in the meantime, she found a bit of a distraction when she began dating a boy she had a history with by the name of Sean McKittrick. Sarah liked Sean and was quite content being with him. But evidently, this relationship made her lapdog Harley increasingly jealous and impatient. After all the time and effort Harley put into trying to date Sarah, she just randomly got a boyfriend. Harley just really found it all frustrating and started to think, you know what? Maybe Adrian could serve as a good replacement. Maybe Harley didn't have to spend every moment of every hour devoted to Sarah. But really, Harley was still infatuated and in love with Sarah and would do anything for her. Meanwhile, on the other side of the conflict though, Adrian was now trying to get into Harley's head. She wanted to figure out why Harley acted one way towards her when Sarah and the others were around, and an entirely different way when they were alone. By now, they had many frequent interactions, just mano-a-mano, and during one exchange of notes in mid-January of 2005, Harley admitted to her the reason why Sarah got so mad at her after she got with the boys at the party house. Harley essentially just told her that it was all a test to see if Sarah found her dateable. And naturally, because of her actions, Adrian failed this test. But that didn't mean that Harley had to dislike her for this. Before long, they were about to start seeking some solace in each other's company. But little did Adrian realize how deadly the consequences would be from such a fling. Because once again, Sarah Kolb was territorial. And if you get in the way of Sarah Kolb's territory, it's going to come at a cost. By January of 2005, Adrian Reynolds had gotten a job at a local Checkers, which, for those that don't know, is a fast food restaurant that serves hamburgers, french fries, and a bunch of other stuff. Adrian worked here a couple days a week, and she really didn't make much money. Therefore, when one of her co-workers, a 26-year-old man with a wife and 3 children, asked her if she could babysit for him for some extra cash, she happily agreed. On one condition, that was, only if she could babysit with her friend Harley. Now, the co-worker making the request was a man named John, and apparently Adrian had a bit of a thing for him. But considering the age difference and the fact that John was married with 3 kids, he had absolutely zero interest. Still, Adrian did seem nice, and he figured maybe she would be good to watch the kids for him. He didn't care if Harley came either, so on Wednesday, January 19th, he happily picked the 2 of them up, and according to him, by this point, Adrian and Harley were acting pretty close. While John never actually dropped them off at his house, instead opting to just drive them over a friend's, he did mention that throughout the time he saw them, they were kissing and hugging each other, and by all appearances, it seemed like the 2 were a couple. And later on, John asked Adrian to watch the kids on Saturday the 22nd, to which she happily agreed. Pretty soon though, it wasn't just Adrian's co-worker, but others that started to pick up on the fact that Adrian and Harley were becoming close, including Sarah Kolb herself. Upon learning about Adrian and Harley's alleged affair, Sarah became absolutely furious. Sure, she had a boyfriend and technically didn't like Harley, but truth is, she had already grown tired of her boyfriend, Sean, and by attempting to date Harley, Adrian was clearly encroaching on her territory. In fact, Adrian even sent Sarah a long note about the whole thing and told her that she was going to be friends with Harley and that she was going to hang out at the party house whether Sarah liked it or not. So needless to say, Sarah was greatly offended by Adrian's growing audacity. Not only was this girl dating her best friend and worshipper Harley, but she was defying her every command? How dare she? Right away, Sarah began coming up with plans for retribution. It was all going to take place on January 21st of 2005 in a Taco Bell parking lot. And while she claims that her idea was initially just to beat her up, you'll see how well that panned out soon. But before we get into the specifics, let's go over the disappearance of Adrian Reynolds. So on January 21st of 2005, when Joanne Reynolds, Tony's wife and Adrian's stepmother, arrived home from work, she walked into the family's ranch-like home and expected to see her stepdaughter there. Despite her initial reluctance to have Adrian live with them because of her chaotic nature, the two of them were making progress in their relationship. A week before, they had gone to a therapy session, and they were scheduled for another one on this night. But after walking in and putting her car keys down on the counter, she then walked past Adrian's room and noticed her clothes laying out on her bed. With Adrian, however, nowhere to be found. Right away, Joanne started to sense that something was off, because Adrian was generally home at this time. Her school day ended at noon, and she generally spent most of her afternoons still at home. Joanne then called out to her husband Tony to see if he was home, and after he responded back saying, yeah, she then asked him if he knew where Adrian was. Tony was tired after a long day of truck driving, a job that oftentimes kept him on the road for 16 to 17 hours a day. He replied to Joanne saying that he didn't know, and together the two of them walked over and peered into Adrian's room. Adrian's work shift started at 5, and by now she would have to be getting ready, but her clothes were still lying there and her shoes were still on the floor. Joanne then decided to start calling all of the rest of Adrian's family and friends to see if they knew where she was. But despite calling practically everyone, no one could give her any answers. Pretty soon, Joanne and Tony drove up to Checkers to see if she was at work, but she wasn't there either. After that, things started to get a little bit more serious. Before long, Joanne and Tony reported their daughter missing to local authorities, and an official investigation began into the disappearance of Adrian Reynolds. Immediately, Joanne and Tony began doing all they could to find their daughter. They put up flyers around the town and began searching everywhere they could possibly think of. And at one point, Joanne even got on the phone with Sarah. Sarah claimed to Joanne that all she did was drop Adrian off at McDonald's on Friday, and that was the last that she had seen her. But in reality, by then, Sarah had already spent the entire weekend bragging about beating up Adrian and trying to convince everyone at the movie theater that she worked at how tough she was. And naturally, police were becoming quite suspicious of her and Harley. But after an entire week of this total nightmare, Tony and Joanne were woken up at 2 a.m. in the morning on January 26th by a police phone call and knock on the door. A knock on the door that no parent ever wants to receive. The police informed them that their daughter, Adrian, was dead. Her body was found dismembered and placed throughout the town, and Sarah Kolb and Harley Quinn were under arrest. Later on, when police interviewed Sarah and Harley, they got conflicting stories on exactly what happened the day that Adrian was murdered. Right away, the two of them began pointing fingers at one another, but the reality was a bit more complex. It all took place over the span of a few days and involved several different locations. The most accurate assessment of what happened comes from a collection of various testimonies and interviews from Sarah Kolb, Harley Quinn, Nathan Gaudette, and several others. And it goes as follows. So as we mentioned before, Sarah Kolb had come up with a devious plan to take care of her problem with Adrian. It was going to come in the form of a fake reconciliation effort. In other words, Sarah was going to act like she wanted to make up with Adrian and be friends with her again. But really, this was all just a trap. And what Sarah was actually planning to do was far more sinister. And so on January 21st, while the two of them were at school, Sarah waited for the lunch bell to ring and then confronted Adrian about the whole situation in the hallway, screaming at her and saying, "I'm going to f-." With the amount of rage Sarah was dealing with, this confrontation almost boiled into a fight between the two. But then Sarah calmed down a bit and came to her senses again, realizing that if she fought her there, she would get suspended. Sarah then looked at the ground and looked back up again and apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that." After the two of them were seemingly friendly again, if only for a short while, Adrian asked Sarah if she could give her a ride home, to which Sarah agreed. Now, Sarah's plan, which was almost derailed by pure rage, was on again. Once school ended, Sarah, her boyfriend Sean, Adrian, and Harley all got into Sarah's car, which was a beat-up old Chevy Prism that looks like this. Before they all left, Sarah asked Adrian if she cared if they stopped at Taco Bell first before they dropped her off at her home, to which Adrian agreed. After the group then arrived at Taco Bell, Sarah pulled into the parking lot. She would have gone through the drive-thru, but her excuse was that the line was too long. Therefore, they would all have to go inside. But instead, the moment they parked, she confronted her about wanting to get with Harley and her boyfriend Sean. At this point, Adrian was tired of backing down, so she defended herself, essentially saying, "Yeah, I do want to get them. What are you going to do about it?" And right away, a fight ensued with Sarah grabbing Adrian's hair and yelling at her. Sarah's boyfriend tried yelling at them to stop, but after he realized the direction this was all heading, he wanted absolutely no part of it. While the girls were fighting, Sean yelled at Sarah to unlock the door and let him out. Busy as she was, she yelled at him to unlock the door himself, and quickly he fidgeted the lock for a second, got the heck out of there, and started walking back to school. A decision that ended up being the difference between prison time and freedom. But after this, things started to escalate even further in Sarah's car. As the fight ensued, it was really a very even match. They exchanged a lot of blows, and Adrian even ended up giving Sarah a bloody nose. Meanwhile, in the Taco Bell parking lot, a few people caught glimpses of what was going on in the car, but it was a bit hard to see because the windows were foggy from all of the heavy breathing. Unfortunately, nobody intervened. Otherwise, things would have turned out a bit different. But before long, back inside of the beat-up car, Sarah had finally gained the upper hand by using the unfair advantage of having Harley hold Adrian down while she choked her. Eventually, Adrian stopped breathing, and Sarah and Harley were now responsible for murder. According to Harley, not long after Adrian was no longer breathing, Harley shouted, "What the f, Sarah?" And by now, Sarah and Harley were panicking. Sarah covered Adrian's lifeless body with a tan leather coat and told Harley that they were going to need to get rid of her somewhere. Right away, she came up with the idea of taking Adrian to her grandfather's farm. But before that, she needed to stop by her house and grab some things. And so Sarah pulled out of the Taco Bell parking lot with Harley in the passenger seat and Adrian on the car floorboard in the back, and drove up to Sarah's house in Moline, Illinois. After parking in the garage, Sarah went into her room upstairs, changed her clothes, and told her stepfather, who we'll call Michael, that Harley was with her, and that they were going to Aledo to visit her grandma. Michael found it weird that Sarah parked in the garage, but he sort of just brushed it off in the moment. Then, heading back down into the garage, Sarah grabbed a red gas can and a blue tarp and threw both items into the trunk of her car. Afterwards, her and Harley got back on the road. The first stop on the 45-minute drive to Sarah's grandparents' farm was a secluded, wooded area known as Big Island. Here, they parked next to a dam, lifted Adrian's body out of the vehicle, and placed her body in the trunk before continuing to make their way to the farm. Once they finally got to the farm, Sarah and Harley then found a wooded area near a large open field, and after parking once more, they relocated Adrian's body to the woods. Here in the woods, they attempted to burn her body using the gasoline that Sarah had brought and a butane lighter. However, after multiple attempts to do so, they eventually realized that this was a futile effort. Even crematoriums use temperatures of up to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, something that can't possibly be achieved with just a simple lighter and gasoline. So late at night, Sarah and Harley called up their friend Nathan Gaudet. Nathan was another juggalo with a particular obsession with gore, violence, the macabre, and worst of all, killing animals. He would have no issue dealing with a dead body. But when Sarah called him over the phone, she didn't even mention the murder right away. In fact, all she asked Nathan was what he was doing, to which he replied that he was trying to, quote unquote, cop some cocaine. After that, they all agreed to hang out. And so shortly before midnight, Sarah drove up to Harley's house, leaving Adrian's body in the woods, and the three of them, Sarah, Harley, and Nathan, all partied together in the wee hours of the morning. Before long though, Sarah and Harley fell asleep, and by the time they woke up, it was almost 2 p.m. in the afternoon on Saturday. At this point, Sarah had to start getting ready for her job at the movie theater. So Sarah and Harley drove back to her house in Moline, and she got ready. Next, her and Harley picked up Nathan again from his grandparents, and while driving back to Harley's house, they relayed to him everything that happened in the Taco Bell parking lot and what they did to Adrian. Nathan was a bit shocked, but the following day, on Sunday, January 23rd, he agreed to help them dispose of Adrian's body. By then, the disappearance of Adrian Reynolds was already becoming a heated subject around the nearby area. Even so, Sarah, Harley, and Nathan all drove back up to Sarah's grandparents' farm, and after entering the wooded area where Adrian's body lay in wait, Nathan used his grandfather's saw in a manner according to Sarah's instructions. The rest of the day, the three of them then relocated Adrian's remains to a couple separate areas throughout the local region. One location was the woods near the farm. The other location was under a black manhole cover in Black Hawk State Park. And oh yeah, on the way to these places, they made sure to stop by McDonald's. But once the long day was over, Sarah dropped Harley and Nathan off at Harley's house. After no longer being in the presence of Sarah, Harley then became a nervous wreck. It was finally starting to settle in what the potential consequences of both of their actions might have been. And to make matters even worse, later that night, Harley and Sarah were both subject to police questioning. At this point, neither of them were willing to provide any information. But by Monday evening, Harley's anxiety had reached a peak. So Harley's sister's name is available, but for privacy purposes, we'll just call her Catherine. While at Catherine's house talking to her, Harley was pale white and pacing back and forth in the living room. Eventually, Harley started crying, and despite Catherine trying to figure out what was wrong, Harley just wouldn't tell her. So she drove them back home to their father instead. But once they got home, Harley received a shocking phone call from Sarah saying that her parents had already hired attorneys for her. So figuring it would be smart to do the same thing, Harley's parents hired an attorney too. And yet Harley still wouldn't tell anyone what happened. All Harley was giving them was fragments, claiming that two girls got into a fight and it was bad. But meanwhile, both of Harley's parents could tell that something had gone terribly wrong. By Tuesday evening, the 25th of January, Harley was visibly shaking and nervous and just couldn't hold back anymore. Harley finally confessed, and the next day, after leading police to Adrian's body, Harley Quinn and Sarah Kolb were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and concealment of a homicide. A few days after she was found in such a terrible manner, a small funeral ceremony was held for Adrian Reynolds. Here was a girl filled with so much potential and energy, now dead at the hands of two of her closest quote-unquote friends. And for what reason? Because of jealousy, anger, probably sociopathy? While, as we noted, Harley's guilty conscience ultimately prevailed, Sarah never demonstrated any real signs of remorse. In fact, in one quote attributed to her, she specifically said, "I was so good at not feeling that I felt no feeling as she died." But over a year after Adrian's death, Sarah Kolb and Harley Quinn's trials took place in mid-2006. These trials were long and arduous processes for Adrian's family and friends. But once they were all over, Sarah Kolb was sentenced to 53 years in prison, while Harley Quinn was sentenced to 45 years in prison. The final person involved, Nathan Gaudet, was also put on trial, and while he only received 5 years in a juvenile detention center, several years later, he ended up dying in a fatal car crash. So yeah, weird how life works sometimes. This case was a bit of a tough one to get through. I really hope that Adrian Reynolds is resting peacefully, and I really hope that her family is doing okay. As for the people who did this to her, well, it looks like they'll be rotting in prison for a while, which, in my humble opinion, is exactly where they belong. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please subscribe and hit the like button because that's all we do. I also have a second account with my brother named Horrifying where we tell stories about everything paranormal. This includes true crime, mysteries, and things that are just downright spooky. I'd greatly appreciate if you subscribe to that too. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.